All right, welcome to Chapter 21, Podcast 2. I didn't give a very good update on what this podcast was going to be about in the last podcast, but this is about shorthanded cell notation for Voltaic cells. All right, because when we have a Voltaic cell, we need a way to write out what they kind of look like without drawing the whole thing. We're going to look at them shorthanded, and we're going to draw them, and you'll see why the shorthanded way is the way that we want to do it. And that's the way you're going to see it on homework questions, exam problems, stuff like that. And so we need to get used to understanding what they look like. So let's take a look at what a shorthanded cell notation looks like. And what we're going to do is we're going to start out with the zinc copper 2 reaction that we've been dealing with so far. So remember that we've got our zinc is reacting with our copper 2 cations, and that's going to produce some zinc 2 cations and solid copper. All right, so remember that we could split this into two half reactions where I've got my solid zinc is producing zinc 2 cations plus 2 electrons, and I've got my copper 2 plus 2 electrons is producing solid copper, right? And we've got oxidation and we've got our reduction. Those are our two half steps. All right, now, right, our first bullet point up there says, right, that oxidation is on the left. All right, so oxidation is on the left. Zinc is being oxidized to zinc 2. So we're going to put both of those things on the left. So I'm going to start with the reactant, and then I'm going to put the product. So zinc is my reactant. So I'm going to write zinc, and zinc 2 is my product. So I'm going to write zinc 2. All right, note, right, on here, we are not putting states of matter. All right, I didn't write down that it was a solid and then it was aqueous or anything like that. I'm not writing down that what the states of matter are. They don't need to go into our shorthanded cell notation. All right, next off, right, our next bullet point says that the reduction is on the right-hand side. All right, just like for our oxidation, right, but they're going to go to the right of the oxidation, but we are going to write the reactant, and then we're going to write the product. So of the two, the reactant is our copper 2. It is being reduced to copper. And again, right, we don't have any states of matter there. All right, next off it says, right, we're going to put in a single vertical line to show a phase boundary. All right, so what that means is that here I've got my zinc. Remember, that's a solid, and that's becoming zinc 2. Those are different phases because I have a solid becoming something that is aqueous. There's a difference in phase between those two, so I'm going to put in a single vertical line. On the other side, I've got copper 2 and copper. Right? Copper 2 is aqueous, copper is a solid, so I'm putting in a single vertical line for that as well. All right, and then to separate the two half reactions, right, we're going to represent our salt bridge, right, but what we're really doing is we're separating out the two half reactions, or like our two beakers, if we looked at it that way when we were looking at our Voltaic cells from earlier. We're going to do that with a double vertical line. So I'm going to put in a double vertical line like that. That is the entire shorthanded cell notation for this reaction. So we're done with that one, right? That represents everything that we need in order to know what's taking place in this reaction. Recall that when we have a spontaneous redox reaction, right, we can then use that to form an electrochemical cell. We've looked at the difference between our zinc and our copper 2 becoming zinc 2 and solid copper, but right, we can have other ones, like my top example here is nickel with copper 2 becoming nickel 2 and solid copper. And the one below it shows zinc and some cobalt 3 becoming zinc 2 and cobalt 2. Now, if you notice, right, the top one, right, this top one, right, the feel of it looks similar to our zinc copper 2, right? I mean, really, the only difference is that we have a solid nickel becoming nickel 2, right? Everything else is basically the same, right? But notice that in this case, right, on the bottom one, there are certainly some differences here. All right, so notice some new things. All right, new things, right, in our shorthanded notation, right? These are things that didn't come up before, but are true for all of our species. So number one, do not include coefficients. All right, so, right, cobalt 3 and cobalt 2 have coefficients of 2. They are not in our shorthanded cell notation, right? Just like our phases aren't in cell notation. All right, number 2, phase changes, right? They have the solid line, right? The one vertical line between them, right? But all right, between cobalt 3 and cobalt 2, no phase change. Yeah, they are being converted from cobalt 3 to cobalt 2. Right? It's actually being reduced from cobalt 3 to cobalt 2 in that case. But there's no line because there's no difference in phase. They're both aqueous. So we can separate them with a comma there, but not a vertical line. All right, and then the last thing is the bullet point on the bottom. Right, it says note that because both species in the reduction are ions, right, they're both aqueous things, cobalt 3 and cobalt 2, right, we have to have some sort of an electrode in that solution, though, to convert them. Right, we have to have that electrode. Right, that electrode has to be present because it needs some way for electrons to flow into that beaker or into that half cell. And so we do that by placing some sort of an inert piece of metal. Usually we're going to pick platinum. Platinum doesn't like to react with anybody, but it is a really good, it's really good at conducting electricity or allowing the flow of electrons to go through it. Right? That's another way of saying the same thing. So something like platinum is usually just stuck into that beaker. Right? So the electrons are flowing from the anode, the zinc side, into this cathode, or the electrode, the platinum cathode in this case, into that side to allow for the reduction of our cobalt 3 to cobalt 2. And now, there is a phase change between the cobalt 3 and cobalt 2 and the platinum. So phase change, there is a phase change there, so we do have that line in between those two. This shows us a Voltaic cell figure, which is the exact same Voltaic cell that was on the end of our previous slide, where we were showing our zinc, right, being oxidized into zinc 2, and our cobalt 3 being reduced to cobalt 2. Right? And so on the previous slide, we saw the shorthanded cell notation, which was zinc line, zinc 2, right, salt bridge, cobalt 3, cobalt 2, and then we had our platinum electrode as well out there, right? And so we have a pictorial view of that over on the upper left-hand side. They're showing all of that stuff, but just written out. And just notice that we need that hunk of platinum right? We need that hunk sitting in there to allow for that reduction part of the reaction to take place. If that wasn't there, the electrons wouldn't have anywhere to go, right? It's not participating in the reaction, right? It's just basically facilitating. It's allowing the electrons to flow through it so that the reaction can take place. So sample problem 21-1 wants us to draw a diagram, right, showing this entire reaction here between our solid 10 plus 2 silver cations producing 10,2 SN2 plus and 2 solid silvers. All right, so our 10 is oxidized. All right, so that's going to take place at the anode. So we're going to have the solid piece of 10 be our anode, and we're going to have our 10,2 be in our solution. So just imagine that this is in solutions here, right? And then on the other side, we've got our silver cathode, right? That's the solid piece, is going to be having some silver cations in the solution, right? Where that is the reduction taking place. And remember, reduction and cathode both start with our consonants. So that's where the cathode is, right? Our electrons are going to flow from anode to cathode. All right, and kind of the way that I think about that, like if I ask you which way the electrons flow from and to, I like to think, okay, well, they flow from the anode, which starts with the letter A, and they're going to flow to the cathode, which starts with the letter C. So they're flowing from the first letter in the alphabet to a letter in the alphabet that is not the first letter in the alphabet. I don't have any much better way of doing it than that. It's just the way that it's stuck in my head. If you just want to memorize anode to cathode, but that's just the kind of like way that I do it. And so, you know, you might use that as well. But our electrons are flowing from the anode to the cathode. And notice in our salt bridge, right, remember that our anions, I use a different color so you can actually see our anions are flowing to the anode side, and our cations are flowing to the cathode side. Right, now that is drawing out this entire, right, reaction to show the voltaic cell. Right, but we're not going to draw a whole bunch of voltaic cells. We're just going to draw out and we're going to write out the shorthanded cell notation. So this whole thing is really just represented by SN, SN2 plus, salt bridge, right, AG plus, and AG, like so. Right? This shorthanded cell notation conveys basically all of this information. But we need to know what the pictorial view looks like so that we know what the shorthanded cell notation is also telling us at the same time. So now we can kind of take a look back and, you know, summarize what we know about voltaic cells thus far. Right? First off, we know that a voltaic cell has to be separated out into two different cells themselves, two half cells that we're going to call them, where our two half reactions are going to take place. One of those being our oxidation and one of those being our reduction. Both of those have to happen simultaneously. You can't have oxidation without reduction and vice versa. So they have to be connected by something. Usually we call that something an external circuit, right? But really that external circuit's a fancy term for, right, a wire that's going to connect the two electrodes, the anode to the cathode. Right? And then we also have a salt bridge in between our two half cells. So they're connected by a wire and a salt bridge. And that salt bridge allows for our charges to redistribute a little bit in order to allow the reactions to take place. Right, remember that each one of our half cells does have to have an electrode, right? Where the oxidation is taking place, we call that the anode, right? And where the reduction is taking place, right, we call that the cathode. Right? And they have to dip into, right, usually our aqueous solution. Most of the time these are going to take place in some sort of an aqueous solution. There are some rare instances where they're going to happen where they can have reactions with gases, but we're never going to come across any of those. All of ours are always going to deal with aqueous things. So just imagine our electrodes dipping into, right, some, right, water solutions with something dissolved in it. All right, one of our half cells, we have the anode. That's where oxidation takes place. Again, anode, oxidation. And the other one has our cathode and our reduction. And remember that our electrons flow from anode to cathode. And yes, I'm trying to write on here when it's sitting in the position. It's very difficult. All right, but just remember that that's what we're going to get out of that. All right, so that should be like our background on Voltaic cells, and especially like how we can, write up our shorthanded cell notation. I know for a fact that we're going to have a shorthanded cell notation problem on our exam, and so definitely take the quiz that revolves around this little podcast so that you can make sure that you understand that shorthanded cell notation so you can get some freebie points on the exam. All right, podcast 3 is coming up next, and that's going to have to do with calculating what we call a standard voltage for these Voltaic cells. All right, I'll see you then.